So here I am with my co-author, Dr. Diane McIntosh, and today we are talking about some of the key learning from our most recent book, You Belong Here: How to Make People Feel Safe, to Be Their Best, Take Bold Risks, and Win. And as we say on the back cover of the book, in this trailblazing partnership between a renowned professional coach, that would be me, and an acclaimed psychiatrist, that would be Diane, we take you on a step-by-step program to being a keeper of the safety flame. That is someone who creates belonging in a hybrid world, grows enriching relationships, owns their power, wins on the brink, and shows the way. As we say, You Belong Here will give you the neuroscience, the tools, and the strategies to create an environment where others flourish, so you will too. And in this conversation, I'm going to focus specifically on aspects of the neuroscience that informs the book, because Diane's specialty, of course, is the brain, and she introduced me to a number of concepts that have changed the way I think about not just how my brain works, but actually how I can take on challenging situations with mastery. So let's talk a little bit, Diane, about how the brain works. In You Belong Here, we talk about the thalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, the nucleus accumbens, the HPAA, neuroplasticity, both good and bad, inflammation versus chronic inflammation, BDNF, mind and body connection. So a whole range of aspects of the brain that the layman has probably never heard of. I had never heard of many of those concepts before. So Diane, maybe let's go through step by step how the brain works, and talk to us about how the brain absorbs information, how it distributes information, and potentially how we can take control of how we absorb information, distribute the information, so we are as empowered as possible to take on the challenges confronting us. I know it's a big question, but then this whole book is about big questions.
You got an hour, Mike? Well, 4 hours. Let me try to do that very quickly and concisely, but please interrupt me as I go through to make sure that I hit the highlights in a way that everyone that's listening really feels comfortable, can understand. So why don't we talk about our limbic system to start with? So the limbic system is the area of our brain that really is involved in how we respond, from a behavioral response, an emotional response to our environment, both our internal environment, so the thoughts and feelings we have, as well as our external environment, what's happening around us. So the limbic system is deep in our brain, and it is critical for our survival. We have to have a functional limbic system to be able to survive, because it does things like drive us to eat, to get food. It helps us to have a drive to make children and also to nurture those children. And it helps us to respond to fearful situations. So from an anxiety perspective, it's really critically important. It gives us our fight or flight response. So what do we do when we're confronted with a scary situation? At the center of that scary situation response center, our fear center, is what's called the amygdala. And the amygdala is really connected to all kinds of different areas in our brain that helps us to react to a stressful situation. And you mentioned the thalamus, and the thalamus is like a way center, a relay center. So all of the sensory information that comes in, what we see, what we hear, what we touch, all of that sensory information, not smell, interestingly, but everything else, comes into the brain, goes to the thalamus, and then gets sent around the brain. And one of the places it goes through is the amygdala, that helps us to decide, how should I react to this situation? Should I be afraid? So it's a really important part of that fear center, the amygdala. When it gets information, it decides, how afraid should I be? Is this a scary situation? And the information that goes to the amygdala, as you know, when you're afraid, you feel it instantly, goes like a neuronal superhighway. It moves very quickly there, because you need speed to survive, right? If something's very scary, you need to know, do I run away? Do I freeze? Do I fight? What is my reaction? So that whole anxiety pathway can be a neuronal superhighway that tells you what to do very, very quickly. An example of that would be if you're confronted by a really scary dog running toward you with its teeth bared. You see a dog, you hear a dog, maybe the dog is close enough that you're touching the dog. All of that information goes through the thalamus to the amygdala like a lightning speed. Your brain says to you, this is scary, I've got to run. That's the amygdala telling you flight, run away, or maybe I got to punch that dog or fight off that dog. So it's a fight or flight. And what you experience, of course, is anxiety.
Got it. Got it. So as you experience that anxiety, some of that anxiety, as we write in the book, is warranted anxiety. So as you indicate, there's some moments you should be scared. If you're walking through a war zone, or you walking through a dark alley in an unfamiliar situation, or someone approaches you with a weapon, that anxiety is a healthy anxiety, and it's going to enable you to survive. But then there's other anxiety, which is internally generated, that, as you say, hijacks your amygdala and immobilizes you. Talk to us a little bit, Diane, about the hijacking of the amygdala and how we handle what we've called those ESMs, extreme stress moments, where the anxiety will be generated by what's going on inside of us, not necessarily by what's going on around us.
Right. So your amygdala is necessary for your survival, and it's actually connected to all kinds of other brain areas, as I mentioned, so that when you're in a scary situation, when that dog is running after you, or you're in that alleyway and you're a little bit anxious, so you're ready for anything, that makes sure that your body is ready. So your heart rate is up a little bit, your blood pressure is up a little bit. It's increasing the blood supply to the parts of your body that need to work immediately and removing blood from other areas. So your body is ready for anything. But unfortunately, when people have a high level of anxiety that doesn't have a reason for its existence, right? People who have anxiety disorders, their body is always ready in that way. They're always feeling ready for anything. And it's a very unpleasant feeling. We know that in just a few minutes of dealing with a dog, it's very unpleasant. That snarly dog that's coming at you, that's not a nice feeling. Well, when you have an anxiety disorder, you feel kind of like that all the time. So that's why I call it being your amygdala hijacking your brain, taking over. Everything feels very scary all the time. And that doesn't mean that it has to stay that way. So we know that anxiety is a very treatable problem, but the first thing you have to do is recognize it. And there's all kinds of tools that are very helpful in overcoming anxiety. One of them is talk therapy, or doing cognitive behavioral therapy. And the way that it works, first of all, is recognizing that you have those experiences, the thoughts that go along with them, the feelings that go along with anxiety that are often very dysfunctional. I'm a loser, everybody hates me, all those thoughts and feelings that you have. First of all, you have to identify them. But the way your brain works, there is actually a lag time between the time that you have a thought and actually taking the action itself. And it's about a quarter of a second, which doesn't sound like very much time, but it's actually an eternity when it comes to your brain. So that's an opportunity for you to be able to have an alternate understanding of that experience. So for instance, if you have PTSD, so a trauma-related anxiety experience, and you hear a car backfire, and you've been in a war zone in the past, you have some time to be able to reinterpret that sound as actually being a car backfiring rather than just that automatic assumption that it's gunfire and sort of hiding and going for cover. So we have a number of parts of our brain that actually can help us to be able to overcome that experience. And one part of our brain is called the hippocampus. Your hippocampus holds the home movies of your life, all the things that are really important to you, that you have a deep emotional connection to. So when you got married, when your children were born, when you graduated from university or from some other really important and meaningful experience, those are held there. And you can use your past experiences from the hippocampus to help you to know how to respond to certain situations that are anxiety provoking. The problem is you can also hold very negative experiences in your hippocampus, and they can be laden with emotion, and that can help to further the power that your amygdala has over you.
So, we talking here about the concept of awareness, self-awareness, conscious awareness, and then subconscious triggers. And so if we think about, and I want to take myself personally, if I think about the fact that about 20 years ago, I went through clinical depression, and if I'm not aware, if I'm not intentional, every time I remember my clinical depression, there's actually a downward pull on my emotions, and I could easily get depressed again because I can focus just on how painful and how long that pain lasted. On the other hand, I also know that the very reason I'm having a conversation with you today, Diane, is because I went through that experience, and it empowered me to live a fantastic life. And in many ways, that experience liberated me to be all I can be and live this life of my dreams. So, Diane, talk to us a little bit about how you can actually apply intention so that you transform those negative emotions driven by your amygdala or the limbic system into empowering emotions, where I believe there's a role that the prefrontal cortex has got to play in the whole process. So just unpack that a little bit for our viewers or listeners.
You ask big questions, Mike. So there's a lot to unpack there. But from a adult having a depression perspective and then coming through the other side actually stronger, that's really a story, your story of resilience, that you have not just endured a difficult experience, but come through it with new skills and gifts and abilities and been able to live a stronger life. So on the resilience side of things, when you have traumatic experience or very difficult memories from your past, like for your depression, you have learned now, when I have those feelings, when I have a negative thing happen, that you're now able to identify, wait, I know where that's coming from. I've had that feeling before. And you've learned how to talk to yourself in a manner that helps you to come up the other side more quickly and be able to move past it rather than letting yourself sit in it. It's a mindfulness technique, actually. So mindfulness and cognitive therapy all kind of fit together. You know you have anxious thoughts sometimes or bad thoughts sometimes. You accept that you have those thoughts. You let them in your front door. You let them out the back door, but you don't serve them tea, which means you accept them and you let them flow through you, but you don't let them sit inside you and take over. And sometimes they do sit down for tea, and you're boiling the water and you wait a minute, I'm not serving these guys tea. So they can be there for a little while for sure, but you've gained the skills to be able to recognize them and allow yourself to come up the other side. And probably with your wife being very helpful and saying, hey, Mike, I see that something's going on here. And that, so you can also use the people around you to help to trigger you to remember, wait a minute, that's not where I want to be. And what are my skills to help me to get through the other side? And just one more neuroscience-y way to look at this is when you're a young person, very young, so a infant, a child who's exposed to trauma, that actually can change your brain. That can change the volume of your amygdala, the size of your amygdala. It can change the thickness of your cortex, which is giving you that sort of thoughtful reflection, your organizing and planning and thinking ahead and critically thinking. So when you have early trauma, it actually changes the way your amygdala talks to that prefrontal cortex, that front part of your brain that is the executive. And that's why it's so hard, that early childhood trauma, and how it increases the risk of developing depression or anxiety, because it's actually altered the way your brain is structured, and that has an impact on functioning. I want to say, however, though, that even if you have childhood trauma and you're struggling with it now, it doesn't mean that it's insurmountable, because you can always learn new skills. And one of the greatest things you can learn is to be more resilient.
So good. So what you've just referenced is this concept of neuroplasticity, both good and bad. So if you have childhood trauma, then there's bad neuroplasticity, and the ability of the brain to handle extreme stress moments may have been contracted or lessened. However, talking to the right people, engaging in the right exercises, reading books like You Belong Here, you can retrain the brain to once again expand its capacity to deal either with complexity or stress. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so very quickly, I think we should define neurogenesis means growing new brain cells. And we haven't known forever, but we've known for quite a while now that you grow new brain cells all throughout your life. We used to think you're born with this many brain cells and that's all you get, but we know that you can continually grow new brain cells. And that's called neurogenesis, new brain cells. Neuro meaning brain cells, genesis meaning new. Neuroplasticity is the way that you're constantly modeling and remodeling your brain by growing new brain cells and also making new connections between those brain cells. What happens when you're severely depressed, you actually lose brain cells in an area of your brain called the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus, that area that holds the home movies of your life. You actually lose brain cells when you have a serious depression. And that has a lot of complications from it, like not being able to recover from your depression the longer it goes on, or having cognitive symptoms related to your depression. So we know that your brain cell growth, neuroplasticity, new brain connections is really tightly tied to your mood and to inflammation. And so when we're talking about recovering from depression, one of the things that happens is you grow new brain cells in the dentate gyrus of your hippocampus. And you do that by a chemical called BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which you have to think of as like brain cell fertilizer. And it's made inside our brain by taking an antidepressant, by different kinds of treatment for depression like ECT or ketamine treatment, but it's also made by talk therapy. We believe, it's very hard to study that, but we know that talk therapy can be very effective in treating depression. So that cognitive behavioral therapy I talked about. We also know that BDNF is increased by exercise. And the good news, mild to moderate intensity exercise. So 30 minutes a day of mild to moderate intensity exercise is enough to increase BDNF, which can grow new brain cells. It's important to know you can't yoga your way out of a terrible depression. If you have a severe depression, you probably will require medication treatment or another kind of neurostimulation treatment. But I absolutely agree that exercise is an important treatment for people who have mild depression. And even as you're recovering from a depression, it can be like a drug and really support your recovery.
So, what's fascinating, Diane, is once you introduced me to the concept of BDNF, and I got in my mind this image of, if I want to grow my brain cells, if I want to grow beautiful things in this mind of mine, I've got to sprinkle it with copious amounts of BDNF. And as you shared with me, it's exercise, so we all have control of that. And, I work out 7 days a week. And I think you also mentioned it's a function of the Mediterranean diet. So it's the food that you put inside of you. It's also the love and the support that you surround yourself with, including, and we had a lot of these conversations, just the act of, if you have a pet, well, then, just hug and smell and touch and just squeeze your pet multiple times a day, and that's going to boost your BDNF. And so there are many ways for us to boost that fertilizer and therefore our performance. Now, just in the last few minutes, Diane, I wanted to just get into a fun part of the conversation, but one that is crucially important, and that is this brain of ours being almost a drug manufacturing facility, in the sense that we can manufacture our own pleasure hormone, dopamine, our natural uppers, which would be endorphins. We can manufacture the love hormone, which is oxytocin, but we can also manufacture the stress hormone, which is cortisol. So just walk us through, let's call it the empowering hormones that we can manufacture that will boost our performance, and then those hormones that our stress causes that potentially will then contract or get in the way of our optimal performance.
So cortisol
Another
is
simple question.
Yeah, yes,
Yeah.
you're very, I'm just going to get right at it. So cortisol is our most important anti-inflammatory hormone. It is how we react to acute and chronic stress and kind of calm it down as quickly as possible. So when you're facing any kind of stressor, there's an increase in cortisol, and that helps to get you react, calming down all of your brain systems that your amygdala has set into action to try to manage a stressor. And what happens when you're under a chronic level of high stress over an extended period? And the worst kind of stress are chronic, unpredictable stresses. And that's like the pandemic. We were all under a high level of stress that was unpredictable. We didn't know who was going to get this, where was it coming from, what should we do, who do we need to be away from, what's going to happen to our loved ones. So that chronic, unpredictable stress is the worst kind of stress for our brain. When you're under that kind of situation, the level of cortisol stays high for way too long. And that high level of cortisol, it's kind of ironic that cortisol is so important for providing an anti-inflammatory response and getting our brain back to normal. So it's protective, but under chronic conditions of stress, it stays high for too long and it can actually damage our brain. It starts this process of activating these brain cells called microglia that generally are vacuuming up our brain, keeping our brain nice and clean. But when you have this high level of cortisol over an extended period, those microglia vacuums stop working. They don't work properly. They're not keeping things clean, and they actually cause job action on the front of other, on the part of other brain cells, like the astrocytes. Those are supposed to be feeding and fueling our neurons, keeping them healthy. And so the microglia put their vacuums down, and the astrocytes stop feeding the neurons. And that's where you end up getting this shrinkage of your brain in the hippocampus. You start losing brain cells. That's all due to inflammation. So when you're in a depressed state where you're losing brain cells, you've got high levels of inflammation, high levels of cortisol that are persisting, what happens is those other areas of your brain that usually would counter those negative effects, like you said, the oxytocin, the dopamine, they're not working as effectively, those systems. And all of those systems sort of have a good side and a bad side. So you mentioned the nucleus accumbens. That's our pleasure center, right? And so when you're falling in love with someone or you're doing something that gives you so much joy or pleasure, you're getting a dopamine hit in that nucleus accumbens. And it's very exciting and it feels great. But if you have a problem with gambling or some kind of substance use, you're getting too much dopamine hitting that nucleus accumbens, and it's reinforcing. You need more and more and more. So you can see that every part of our brain has sort of a yin and yang side to it. Just the right amount of cortisol brings that your brain back to homeostasis quickly after a stressor. Too much cortisol ends up damaging your brain. A little bit of dopamine, ooh, that feels great. Too much dopamine, you're in an addiction kind of situation, which is hard to overcome.
So, let's zero in, and I've got two final questions here, but let's zero in on this concept of homeostasis, which is achieving the inner equilibrium that enables you to play at your best. That's where you are in a state of balance. So, Diane, to the people listening to us who are not in depression, but certainly, like you and I, are confronted with escalated levels of stress on any given day, or as you indicated, chronic unpredictable stress on any given day. How do we find that homeostasis? How do we find just the right amount of cortisol so that the body performs its anti-inflammatory activities, and the right amount of dopamine and endorphins so that we feel optimistic and buoyant enough to take on what we have to? What's the secret to homeostasis?
I think another word that maybe sounds less sciencey would be equanimity, the sense of feeling generally at peace. And I think that, first of all, if you're really struggling with anxiety or depression, for heaven's sakes, reach out to your family doctor, to a nurse practitioner, through virtual care, but trying to make sure that you reach out maybe to a psychologist and see whether or not you would benefit from some treatment. But just from a day-to-day perspective, seeking equanimity, I think the greatest protector of our mental health is social support. And so that could mean your friends, making sure to maintain those friend relationships. workmates, because we spend so much time at work, taking the time, and especially in a virtual world, to just reach out and say, hi, hey, how are you doing? Because many of us aren't going into the office anymore. Reaching out to your friends, because when we help other people, we help ourselves. You know, when we let other people know that we love them, we get their love back. Volunteering, you said pets, faith. If you're a person of faith, making sure that you're maintaining those faith connections are really important. And then those other pieces that we mentioned earlier, eating a healthy diet, a Mediterranean diet we know is anti-inflammatory, exercise, keeping your, and maybe don't call it that, call it increased physical activity, because I don't want people to be overwhelmed by the word exercise. Just getting your heart rate up 30 minutes a day, that's enough. So reaching equanimity, or maintaining that sense of centered peace and calm, I think at its core is having that social support. And, you know, it's another thing we can dig into at one point, Mike, is we have a loneliness epidemic. People feel very isolated, and that has an impact not just on your mental health, but on your physical health. What are some of the ways that you can start to, if you are feeling lonely, reach out in a manner that is sustaining? And if you don't have a lot of people around you, reaching out maybe through a community organization, doing something you enjoy, volunteering, going to your local community center to take a class, all of those things that help you to make real human contact are critically important in helping your brain to be in that state of calm. But if you're really, really struggling, please reach out. It's so important, because it's difficult. You can't friend your way out of a severe depression or overwhelming anxiety. They're a piece of your recovery.
Wow. Well, look, Diane, I'm actually going to close right there because we covered so much ground in such a short period of time. We will be having a lot more of these kind of conversations moving forward. But I know anyone who's been watching or listening to us is taking some real insights and techniques away to boost their sense of well-being, their sense of efficacy, and most importantly, their ability to create an environment where others flourish so they can too.